the cowboy, swore they'd learn together, no matter the cost. Before we ride into this tale, drop a comment and tell me the name of your town where you're listening from tonight. And when we reach the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Now, let's begin. Montana Territory, early spring, 1878. Snow still clung to the Bitterroot Mountains, and the cold wind slipped through the dark pine forest, carrying the breath of a winter that hadn't quite let go. Gideon Thorne was riding the ridge, following the tracks of a stray calf. When his horse stopped short, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, it was a woman leaning against the trunk of a black pine, her coat torn, boots caked in mud, her breath showing in thin, white streams. She looked up at him with a gaze both wary and worn, like some wild creature trying to stand again after the storm. She didn't beg, she didn't cry, she only whispered, "I need help." And in that moment, before they even knew each other's names, a lost soul was found, and a journey toward healing began, one they could never walk alone. A stranger in the winter woods, the trail ahead was narrow and crooked, glazed with old ice where thawing snow mixed with mud beneath the shadow of black pines. Gideon Thorne tightened the reins, his horse snorting out a thin cloud of steam. She was still there, sitting against the tree, her hands scraped and bleeding, lips trembling. He didn't ask a single question. Instead, he leaned down, offering his rough, calloused hand. Vera hesitated, but in the end, she placed her frozen fingers into his palm. His grip was firm enough to pull her to her feet, gentle enough not to scare her. He lifted her onto the saddle, wrapped his heavy coat around her shoulders, and turned the horse toward the valley. The whole ride down, neither of them spoke a word. Some things don't need to be asked right away. Like trust, sometimes it's given, simply because someone stopped at the very moment you were about to fall. Part 1. Strangers and Caution. The small log cabin sat on the hillside, smoke curling up from a leaning chimney. Out on the open ground, the wind pushed through weathered boards, carrying with it the faint scent of pine sap and melting snow. Inside, the main room glowed with firelight. The hearth was burning hot, red coals popping and crackling, throwing a deep, flickering glow across the scuffed wooden walls that had stood through many winters. Vera sat in a straight-backed wooden chair beside the fire, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee still steaming in the chill. She didn't drink. The heat simply rose and vanished into the cold space between them. Gideon sat on the hearth, iron poker in hand, nudging a few more logs into the flames. The light caught his hair, reflected in the depth of his eyes, though he never looked directly at her. Beyond the wind rattling at the door, the only other sounds were the steady burn of the fire and the distant clink of horseshoes in the barn. She still wore his loose work shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbow, showing fresh red scratches along her arms. Her hair was tied back with an old strip of leather, though a few loose strands clung to her pale cheeks. He was the first to break the silence. His voice, as soft as if he were talking to himself. "You travel far." Vera didn't answer right away. She kept her gaze on the coffee, as if weighing every word before letting it go. Finally, her voice came quiet and dry. "From Idaho, south of Salmon." Gideon glanced up. "That's near 100 miles. I walked most of it." In that moment, in the warm cabin, he understood. He was looking at someone who had spent the last of her strength just to get here. And maybe you, listening now, can feel the same pinch in your chest because he didn't ask why, only how far. Sometimes we're not ready to speak about the pain. We just want someone to notice how far we've come to find a place to sit still. Night fell quickly in Montana. The wind brought the scent of snow down from the bitterroots, slipping through the cracks in the door. Gideon added more wood to the fire, then moved to check the front latch. Vera sat unmoving, her shadow stretching long across the worn floorboards, leaning just slightly toward the flames, as if she could draw a little more warmth into her bones. He set a gray wool blanket beside her chair. Guest rooms in the back. Beds made. She nodded once. No thank you. No question. Just a quick glance at his face, a fast, measuring look, like she didn't want to be caught studying him. Outside, the bare birch branches slapped against the siding with a hollow, wooden sound. It mixed with the steady heartbeat of someone inside the cabin who wasn't ready to trust yet. Gideon stepped back to the chair by the kitchen table, quietly drying his worn leather gloves. He didn't try to make conversation. He understood that her silence wasn't rudeness. It was a wall built for survival. Vera shifted, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. Firelight caught her eyes, showing lines of weariness that had been there for years. She knew she was in a safe house, but her heart wasn't ready to believe it. The man hadn't asked who she was, where she'd come from, or why she'd been walking the winter woods, and somehow that made her all the more cautious. Sometimes, kindness without demand is more frightening than 100 sharp questions. From the far corner, the wall clock ticked steady. Each second was a small step, leading either toward a truth that had to be told, or a silence that might never break. That first night at the ranch, the snow outside the porch eased to nothing. A thin crescent moon hung low, spilling pale silver through the small back window of the guest room. Gideon lay in his own bed, heavy quilt pulled to his chest, but sleep wouldn't settle. Through the thin wooden wall, he heard footsteps, slow, then quick, then stopping, a pause, then again. Vera was pacing, not searching for anything, not doing any chore, just crossing from one corner to another, like someone who couldn't bear to be still. The old floorboards creaked under her weight, and the sound carried into his chest like the strained heartbeat of someone waiting for danger to return. Gideon stared at the dark ceiling. He knew she couldn't sleep. Folks who've lived too long in fear need more than one season to believe a locked door is truly locked, and that no one waits outside. After a while, the footsteps stopped. He heard her sit on the edge of the bed, breathing out so softly it might have been a sigh or the last mile of a 100-mile road. He didn't get up, didn't knock. He just stayed still, letting her know, without saying it, that if she needed him, he was awake, because some wounds, touched too soon, only close tighter, and Gideon Thorne, in his quiet way, had chosen to be an unseen guard for the stranger in his home. Outside, the wind swept over the dry grass, scraping at the boards like the past still trying to get in. But tonight, at least in this house, it would stay outside. The first morning, mist lay low over the ground, morning light sliding slow down the hills into the valley like a wool blanket being spread across the earth. From the barn came the sound of roosters and the heavy breath of horses in the cold. Gideon was outside early, wearing his thick coat, the leather gloves long broken in. He saw Vera standing at the rail fence, her back to the cabin, hands resting on the top slat. His work shirt hung loose on her shoulders, sleeves slipping down, hair tied back but already loosening in the breeze. She didn't turn when she heard his boots on the damp earth. Her eyes stayed on the far horizon, where snow on the Bitterroot peaks caught the gold of the rising sun. Maybe she was thinking of some other place, or deciding whether she would leave this one. "You're up early." His voice was low, as if not to disturb the fragile quiet. Vera nodded, eyes still far away. "I'm used to it. Sleeping in. Don't sit right." He leaned on the fence beside her, not close enough to make her step back, but close enough that his warmth reached the space between them. and maybe you can see it too. Trust isn't given all at once. It's something that takes standing through 100 mornings like this, silent, waiting for the other person to decide today isn't the day to walk away. The early wind stirred the birch leaves, and Vera's hands tightened on the rail, like holding herself steady. That afternoon, the sky turned thick and gray, the smell of wet earth slipping in through the window. In the kitchen, firelight washed over the walls, making the room feel warm, though the silence still sat between them. Gideon set a pot of beef stew on the table, steam curling into the smell of fresh bread. He poured her a fresh cup of coffee and set it within reach. Saw you near the corral today. You work with horses. His voice was easy, like talking about the weather. Vera took the spoon, but didn't lift it. I grew up on a small ranch. Horses? Don't ask much. He let a small smile show. Same as me. The moment could have carried on, but she set the spoon down, her gaze pulling back like a rider, easing away from the edge of a cliff. Maybe afraid she'd say too much, or afraid of the next question. I don't like owing anybody. Gideon. The words came out fast, as if she needed to put them between them before anything else. He paused, met her eyes, and said it plain. You don't owe me a thing. And that, somehow, made her chest ache. You can feel it, can't you? How safety can feel strange, even dangerous to someone used to living without it. She bowed her head, took a small spoonful, tasting beef and bread, and something saltier, tears she'd never admit to, slipping into the bowl before anyone could see. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping against the roof like the heartbeat of a shelter. But not yet a home. Not today. Part 2. Secrets revealed. Night lay over the valley like a heavy blanket. The wind followed its old path along the banks of Lolo Creek, carrying the damp scent of moss-covered stone all the way to the porch. In the kitchen, the oil lamp glowed gold, like the quiet, watchful eye of a fox. Its light stretched across the worn floorboards, over scratches that mapped out the winters gone by. On the cast-iron stove, the coffee pot bubbled low. Gideon used thick gloves to lift it from the heat, poured into 2 tin cups, the soft chime of metal on metal breaking the hush. He set 1 cup in front of Vera, and with his other hand, eased the window shut against the draft. Outside, the birch branches scraped the siding, sometimes cracking sharp as brittle bone. Vera sat straight-backed across from him, his loose work shirt hanging on her in a way that wasn't hers, but somehow, by some quiet magic, gave her 1 extra breath of ease. Her hair was tied back, though a few strands clung to her cheek. She reached to push them away, stopping when she noticed the rough skin of her fingertips, the bruised nail where it had split. Coffee's strong, Gideon said gently, as though apologizing for something he had no need to. But it's warm. She gave a small nod. Steam rose from her cup, brushed her face, and disappeared. She didn't drink, not from fear, but because her throat felt bound by a rope knotted somewhere in the past. In the lamplight, her eyes held the reflection of the fire, dark, deep, and still, like water that had not been disturbed for so long that one touch might shatter it. I don't ask, Gideon said, setting the words on the table, the way a man sets a knife back in its sheath. Because when you're ready, you'll tell me yourself. She looked at him. Not thanks, not suspicion, but like someone who had traveled too far and was learning to trust the first steps on a floor that didn't creak underfoot. Her arms tightened around her own frame, the reflex of someone who believed warmth could vanish the moment she let herself relax. I left Idaho, she said, her voice rough, south of Salmon. He nodded, waited, walked most of it, avoided the main roads, avoided people I knew, avoided the smell of whiskey. The word whiskey dropped into the air, sank beneath the mingled scent of lamp smoke and coffee, leaving a metallic taste behind. Gideon didn't move toward her. He only turned the cup slowly in his hands, letting the heat seep into the calluses worn dark as oak. "I've got 2 kids," Vera went on, eyes fixed on the fire. "Left them in Elk Bend with a widow. She's kind, knows how to keep a secret." Gideon drew a breath so quietly it barely disturbed the thread that carried her voice across the room. He'd heard of Elk Bend, a place where gossip traveled faster than wind through the canyon. But tonight, he held on to just 2 words, kind and keep. The wind pressed harder. The lamp swayed, the light shifting across the floorboards, revealing deeper cracks. From a hook near the door hung a worn gray cloth. Vera reached for it, rolling it in her palm to still the tremor in her hands, then opened it again. In one corner, a single stitch stood out in red, small but red, a reminder that the world still held colors beyond gray and black. "I've kept this since last spring," she murmured. "The day he came." The word he carried no shake, no raised tone. But the kitchen took on the chill of another window opening, letting in a darkness that didn't belong to the mountains. Gideon rested his elbows on the table, lacing his fingers, asking nothing. In this valley, folks hunted game with silence and with pain. Silence was the only way to let it step out of the brush on its own. He said the right things. Vera continued, a twist at the corner of her mouth that wasn't a smile, just right enough to make me believe I wasn't crazy to trust him. "My husband died in the mines. I had nothing left but the children. He brought firewood, patched the roof, held my boy when he cried. Kindness came fast, like the first summer rain smelled of earth, made me think the drought had passed." She clenched the gray cloth, the red stitch hidden in her palm. "Then one Saturday night, he drank. After that, anything could be my fault. Supper too salty, the horse sick, the wind blowing the lamp, even my silence. He said I was silent like someone guilty." Gideon pictured another kitchen. Not this one where a woman learned to stand so her feet made no sound, learned to breathe so no man would take notice. Lessons no soul should ever have to learn. "I left the children," Vera said, her throat trembling like a guitar string plucked by the wind. "Because if I took them, he'd have reason to come after me with everything he had. I left them because at least in the daylight, someone was there." Here, she glanced around the warm, strange kitchen here. The nights too long. The kitchen could hear its own heartbeat. The wood popped in the stove, a log breaking down into damp coals. Gideon slid her cup of coffee a little closer, not urging, just narrowing the distance between his hand and hers. "How long have you been on the road?" he asked at last. Voice no louder than the fire's breath. "Long enough to forget I ever had a name other than Hay or you." She drew in a breath. "Long enough for my feet to know the road better than my head." A cloud passed across the moon, thickening the dark inside. Vera's gaze went to the oil lamp, small but steady. Then she laid the gray cloth on the table, folded it into quarters, and set her hand over it, like pressing down on something she wanted to keep still. "I'm not telling you this for pity," she said slowly, "but so that if one day I'm gone before dawn, you'll know. It wasn't because of you." Gideon straightened, listening to her words, the way a man tracks a lost calf through the timber without hurry, without looking away. "I'm not good at staying," Vera admitted, her lashes lowering against a wave she fought to keep from breaking. "I hear a door close, and I want to run. I see kindness, and I brace for a blow. I see a hand reaching, and I look for the way out, somewhere up on the hill. Horror. Jeskarpa zamikero." A coyote called, not in threat, but like it was speaking aloud. the name of something she didn't want named. Gideon tilted his head, hearing both that cry and the thick silence between them. "Vera," he said, the first time he'd spoken her name tonight. Steady, without hesitation. "If you ever leave, I'll understand. But tonight, this door is barred. The stove has wood, and that cloth, if you forget it, it'll still be here." She looked at the gray cloth. The red stitch glowed like a coal that hadn't gone out. And maybe you feel it too. A small kitchen, an old cloth, a man who asks for no promise, and a woman allowed, for the first time, not to explain herself. Trust doesn't always come in the words "I'll stay." Sometimes it comes in the right to leave without being called a traitor. Vera touched the rim of her cup, finally taking a sip. The coffee was bitter, but the night shortened by a measure. She set the cup down, palm still over the cloth, like holding a steady breath. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. "One more thing," she said, eyes on the fire. "Tomorrow morning, if you see me at the fence like today, don't ask what I'm thinking. Just stand there with me." Gideon nodded, a nod like laying the first stone of a foundation, quiet, but strong enough to build on. In the far corner, the clock struck twice midnight. Vera closed her eyes for a heartbeat, as if trying on the feeling of lowering her guard. When she opened them, she said without flinching, "I ain't good at love." The words fell into the kitchen like a stone dropped into a frozen pond. No splash, but a fracture spreading beneath the surface. And maybe you, listening now, feel your chest tighten, not because the words surprise you, but because they sound like a verdict she'd been serving all her life. Gideon stayed still. It took him a moment before he spoke, voice low as a horse's breath in cold air. "Then, we'll learn together." Vera's brow drew tight, as if she wasn't sure she'd heard him right. "Learn? Yeah, not to love the way a book says, but the way we can, if you'll stay. If you'll stay." No demand, just a key set down on the table, hers to take or leave. Vera's breath caught. In the firelight, his eyes held no judgment, no measure, only waiting. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not. I've still got 2 kids. We'll go get them when you're ready." The certainty in his tone didn't come from oath or promise, but from the kind of stillness she'd never seen in a man before. Still as an autumn lake, no ripples, but deep. She lowered her head, hands still clasped, but this time not tight. "If I stay, then we'll learn, one day at a time." Outside, the rain kept falling, and the wind seemed to soften. Between them, the red stitch in the gray cloth lay like a promise taking root. The next morning, mist blanketed the grass, turning the sunlight into pale streaks. The air smelled of wet earth and the rain from the night before. Gideon rose early as always. Passing through the kitchen, he found a cup of coffee still hot on the table, not his, but Vera's. She stood at the window, back to him, looking out at the birches, trembling in the morning wind. He didn't call to her, just poured his own coffee, sat at the table. Through the misted glass, the first light brushed her profile, glinting in the strands of hair the fire hadn't revealed the night before. "Rain'll be gone by noon," Gideon said, as if just filling the space between 2 breaths. She nodded slightly, didn't turn. "I don't know how long I'll be here." He sipped his coffee, didn't ask why. "Stay as long as you want. The door's open." It was like tossing a stone into still water, not loud, but sending quiet rings outward. Her fingers traced the window frame, following the smooth grain polished by years. And maybe you know this too. Some decisions don't need a grand announcement, just a morning, a sentence with no strings, and a hand learning the feel of something that won't let go. Gideon stood, heading for the door. "I'm going to the barn. If you want, you can come." She hesitated a moment, then turned. "Give me a minute." He nodded. didn't watch her go, but somehow he knew she'd follow. By midday, thin clouds drifted from the Bitterroot peaks, showing the pale spring sky. In the yard, Gideon was repairing a loose rail on the corral. The steady thud of his hammer mingled with the cluck of hens nearby. From the porch, Vera stepped out, wearing her old coat patched at the shoulder by his hand. One hand stayed in her pocket. The other held the folded gray cloth. She walked toward him, eyes on the rail he was setting. "Need me to hold it steady?" she asked. Gideon squinted against the sun. Always, she took her place across from him, holding the rail firm as he drove the nails. The closeness was enough for her to hear the wood's small complaint under the hammer and the slow, even rhythm of his breathing like a heartbeat with no hurry in it. When the last nail was set, he leaned an arm on the rail, not looking directly at her, but speaking plain. "If you're going to leave, today's a fine day for it." She studied him. It wasn't a dismissal. It was the gift of choice, something no one had ever given her before. "I think I'll stay." The words left her light as wind, but they carried the weight of every mile she'd walked to get here. Gideon didn't grin, just gave a small nod, like he'd known it already. "Then we start here." She opened her hand, showing the gray cloth, the red stitch catching the sun. She laid it on the new rail, marking the spot, not for him, but for herself. And maybe you feel it now. How a home doesn't always begin with four walls, but with a choice to stand still beside someone. Day after day, the wind lifted from the valley, carrying the warm scent of earth and the promise of spring. In that wind, neither of them spoke again, but both knew the important things had already been said. Part 3. The promise to stay. Night wrapped itself over the valley like a heavy cloak. In the cabin, the fire growled low in the stove, chewing through damp pine logs that still carried the sweet resin of the tree. The flames licked the walls, stretching the shadows of two people long and trembling like figures learning how to stand still after a lifetime on the move. Vera sat close to the stove, both hands cupping a warm tin mug. Though her eyes weren't on the fire, she looked at the gray cloth folded neatly on her lap, the single red stitch at one corner like a deliberate wrong note left there to remember. Smoke from the fire, the scent of coffee, and the wool and leather smell of Gideon's coat drying nearby all mingled into a kind of gentle perfume she'd never belonged to before. Gideon sat across from her, poker in hand, coaxing the embers so the fire could breathe steady. He didn't hurry, didn't press. The only sounds were the soft crack of pine and the steady sigh of wind pressing against the cabin, now and then lifting the coarse cloth curtain like a reminder. Out there was the long dark, but in here, the night was warm enough for truth. "I don't know where to start," Vera said, voice low enough the fire had to lean in to hear. "Start where it's easiest to stand." Gideon told her, eyes still on the flames. "Leave the hard parts for tomorrow." She pressed her lips together, smoothing the cloth in her lap. That tiny red stitch lay quiet, like a seed waiting for someone to put it in the ground. "I've been making jokes with fate for a long time," she whispered, "running until my feet didn't have any other name but keep going." "You sitting still feels strange." Gideon nodded, like a man hearing a song he hadn't listened to all the way through in years. He set the poker aside, leaned his elbows on his knees, and for the first time that night, looked straight into her eyes. That look didn't ask why. It asked now, "We'll learn together if you'll stay." The words landed soft on the wood floor, making no sound, but they shifted the room all the same. Vera's head lifted, her eyes widening just a little, as if someone had called her name from a shore where there was no storm. She didn't answer right away. The fire crackled once, sighed, then steadied. Their shadows drew closer on the wall. "Learn what?" she asked, her voice rough from the wind that lived inside her. "How to set a bowl down without flinching, how to leave a window open without fearing someone's outside, how to hear a horse call in the night and not think it's footsteps chasing you, how to live, how to love in our own way. He paused, then added, quiet as the ember's breath, how to stay. Her eyes lowered, a few strands of hair slipping from the loose knot and grazing her cheek. She turned the cloth in her hands, her fingertips brushing the red stitch. In the firelight, it flared for a moment like a small coal that could speak. And maybe you can hear it too, a tiny click inside your own chest, the sound of an inner latch dropping, or maybe lifting, hard to tell which, because in the gentlest Western romances, the tenderest moment isn't a kiss under a wide open sky. It's when someone decides to stop keeping watch. I'm afraid, Vera admitted, and the confession landed like a glass of water set down after a long, dry day. Afraid I'll break it all. Afraid whatever this is won't survive once someone touches it. Afraid that tomorrow morning I'll wake up and it'll all turn out to be a dream. Gideon shifted forward, poured her half a cup more coffee. Steam rose, blurring one corner of the world between them. He didn't touch her hand. The space stayed wide enough for fear to breathe, but his voice laid a bridge across it. If you're scared, we'll be scared together. If your hands shake, we'll wait until they don't, before we go on. If you leave one morning, this chair will still be here for you when you come back. I won't promise more than I can carry, but I will promise I won't raise my voice over what you're not ready to give. She studied him a long time. At the edge of her eyes, something wet didn't fall, only deepened the dark of her lashes on the windowsill. A small wood-whittling knife caught the lamplight, lying next to a coil of twine and a tin of nails, the silent witnesses to 100 small jobs done without words. She reached for the knife. Blade turned in and scored a short, slanted mark into the edge of the table. "What's that?" Gideon asked, the faintest curve in his voice. "A mark to remember," Vera said. "So tomorrow, I'll know this was the night I agreed to learn." She set the knife back where it had been, resting her palm over the fresh cut, the warmth of her skin seeping into the wood. The gray cloth stayed in her lap, its red stitch staring into the fire like it was hearing a prayer. None of it said forever. It only said enough for tonight. Gideon leaned back in his chair. From somewhere deep in the barn came the sound of a horse's breathing changing slower, steadier. He glanced toward the window. Tomorrow's supposed to be dry. "I'll pull down some old planks from the shed. We'll build a shelf by the stove for the salt and cornmeal. You want to keep the cloth there?" She blinked. A question with no wrong answer. But here in the West, a simple kitchen shelf can be the softest vow, a place where something's allowed to stay. "Yes," she said, just loud enough for the fire to hear. "I do." The room leaned a little toward home, somewhere out in the dark. A pack of coyotes sang, not as a threat, but as if to remind them the land was bigger than fear. On the wall, their shadows shortened, the flames steadying. Vera drew a long breath, in and out without counting. For the first time in months, Gideon, she said his name, like testing the fit of a new saddle. "If I forget how to be gentle, don't leave. Just tell me to slow down. I'm not much for talking," he admitted, "but I know how to wait and how to start over, even if we just broke it." Her smile was small, but it trembled, the way the last snowflake clings to a windowsill still bright in the firelight. The next morning, sunlight poured through the kitchen window, thick and golden as honey. The wind had dried, carrying the smell of new grass and earth freed by the long rain. On the table, Vera's gray cloth lay folded, as if it had been waiting for this morning. Gideon brought in a few pine boards. Their resin still fresh, he set them on the floor. "Today, we make the shelf," Vera stood in the doorway, tin mug in hand, steam curling from her coffee, just for salt and cornmeal. And for the cloth, he said soft as breath, but with eyes that meant it. She hesitated, then came closer. He handed her a small chisel and a plank. Put something underneath, just for you. She looked at the wood, then at him, kneeling. Her fingers shook a little as she carved a single line with a small circle in its center. It wasn't a letter, not a sign anyone else would understand, just hers. A quiet way of saying, I belong here. Without speaking it out loud, he built the frame, sanded the edges smooth, and together they fixed it to the wall beside the stove. The sound of the hammer, the snug fit of the boards, and the mingled scents of pine resin and coffee filled the little room like a hearth in the chest. When it was done, Vera folded the gray cloth and set it on the top shelf. The red stitch faced outward, catching the light like a spark that refused to die. And maybe you can see it now, how love in the West doesn't always come with flowers or vows, but with a shelf wide enough for a single cloth, strong enough to hold through winter and mountain wind. Gideon stepped back, hands on his hips, and nodded. Looks right. Kitchen's complete now. Vera's smile was quiet, complete. For now. 2 days later, frost clung white to the grass, cold enough that horse and rider both breathed smoke into the morning air. Gideon had saddled the 2 best horses, checked the cinches twice, and tied blankets behind each saddle. Vera stepped onto the porch, with the gray cloth wrapped loosely at her neck. She didn't say ready or let's go. She just set her boot in the stirrup and swung into the saddle, like she knew this was something that had to be done. They left the ranch before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Hooves drummed a steady rhythm on the dirt road, blending with the slow sigh of the pines along the valley. The early wind carried the scent of resin and the cold stone of some unseen stream. Gideon rode ahead, glancing back now and then. Vera kept close, eyes fixed on the misted road. Her heartbeat was uneven, not from fear, but from knowing she'd see 2 faces soon enough to make her chest ache. By the time they reached Elk Bend, the sun was level with their shoulders, and the light had turned warm. The little town hadn't changed weather-worn gray buildings, the creak of a store sign in the breeze, hoof prints in the main street's damp dirt. The widow's house sat at the far end, near a row of birches dropping their leaves. They dismounted. Gideon waited at the gate while Vera went in first. Rhoda was the first to run out, 8 years old. Dark hair, tied quick, eyes bright like sun breaking through after rain. She threw herself into Vera's arms, holding so tight they both swayed. Russ, 6, came slower, eyes measuring Gideon before wrapping his arms around his mother from the other side. Vera bent to hold them both, her shoulders trembling but no sob escaping. Gideon stood back, hand resting on his saddle, watching with the stillness of a man who knew this was a moment that belonged entirely to someone else. And maybe you feel it too, how love sometimes means knowing when to keep silent, so another soul can have the moment they've waited their whole life for. They stayed the night at the widow's. Vera slept between her children, one arm over each, making up for the nights lost. Gideon sat near the stove, eyes closed, but ears tuned to the steady breath of all 3. The next morning, they rode out Rhoda behind Vera, Russ in front of Gideon. The way back to the ranch felt shorter, not just from the horses' pace, but because all 4 were traveling in the same direction now. By the time the Bitterroots showed on the horizon, the sun was already sliding west, pouring gold into the valley. They rode into the yard as the chickens called themselves home, and the air still smelled of the hay cut that morning. Rhoda jumped down first, circling the porch, like she meant to learn every inch of it. Russ clung to Gideon's arm, eyes busy on the corral, the fence, the fresh wagon ruts in the dirt. Vera stepped into the kitchen first. It looked just as she'd left it, but something was different. Maybe the sound of children's feet mingled with the crackle of fire, or maybe the way Gideon stood in the doorway, watching them move like they'd always been here. "We'll need more sleeping space," Vera said, half to herself. Half to him. "I know," Gideon replied. "Tomorrow, I'll start taking down the back wall. We'll make 2 new rooms." She turned, pausing. 2, one for Rhoda, one for Russ. They'll need their own space, and so will you. The air seemed to still for a heartbeat, not because the words were grand, but because they reached beyond a season, and maybe you feel it, that a home isn't just built with wood and nails, but with the act of making room for someone to stay longer than they'd planned. The first day, he took down the wall. Gideon started before sunrise. The hammer's thud echoed in the frost-bitten air. Boards came away to show the frame darkened with age. Vera stood by in a long-sleeved shirt, hair tied neat, steadying the ladder, passing nails, holding the new boards in place. Rhoda sat on the porch with a bucket of screws, and Russ ran in and out with a hammer barely bigger than his hand, copying Gideon's every move. At noon, they ate right there on the floor. Smell of fresh-cut pine mixing with the dust in the sunbeams. Vera handed Gideon a piece of cornbread from the day before. He took a bite, then offered the rest to Russ without a word, smiling when the boy settled down beside him. Once, a hard gust came down the valley, making the new boards shiver in their frame. Vera stepped up to brace them, her eyes meeting Gideon's for just a second. He nodded, kept driving the nails. That nod said, "I see you here." 12 days later, the new room stood finished. The window faced east, catching the day's first light. Rhoda was the first inside, bare feet, on the new boards, still rich, with the smell of the forest. "It's ours?" she asked. Vera nodded. "Yours and Russ's." The little girl's smile was small, but certain the smile of someone reclaiming something she thought she'd lost forever. That night, the children slept easy in their new space. Vera stepped onto the porch, finding Gideon sitting on the steps, hammer at his side. He didn't look up. "This place feels different now," he said. She sat beside him, no scarf, letting the cold touch her throat. Different, in a good way. They didn't speak again, but their hands found each other, and in the scent of fresh-cut wood and the quiet of the yard, the promise "we'll learn together, if you'll stay" was no longer just words. It had become part of the house itself. Part 4, Reunion and Building a Home. The road from Elk Bend to the ranch seemed shorter with 4 riders. The ground had dried under several days of sun, and young grass was pushing up along the trail. Warm earth and pine resin drifted on the wind, wrapping around them like a welcome. Rhoda rode behind Vera, her small arms tight around her mother's waist, her head resting on her shoulder. Now and then, she pointed out what she saw to Russ, a patch of purple lupine blooming against a rock face, a flock of sparrows bursting from a fence rail. Russ sat in front of Gideon, small hands gripping the saddle horn, eyes wide, drinking in every detail, as if he could keep it all. When the ranch gate came into view, the spring wind carried familiar scents: dry hay, pine timbers, and the warm breath of the barn. Gideon swung down first, helping Russ to the ground before turning to lift Rhoda from the saddle. Vera dismounted last, her boots just touching the dirt, when the children tore off around the yard, like calves loosed into pasture. "Is this our home?" Rhoda asked, her voice a mix of hope and hesitation. "It's home for all 4 of us," Vera said, her eyes flicking to Gideon. They stepped into the kitchen. The big wooden table, once too large for 2, now felt just right. Gideon stoked the stove, while Vera unpacked a small clay jar of cornmeal the widow had sent along. The children circled, full of questions: how many chickens in the coop, if berries grew here in spring, whether they could plant pumpkins, like in Elk Bend. "And maybe you feel it too," A house changes, not because of new walls or a fresh roof, but because of new voices filling its rooms. That night, they ate their first meal together. Cornbread, beef stew, and carrots roasted in the coals. Russ sat next to Gideon, now and then spooning meat into the man's bowl, like he was sharing a prize. Vera watched, hands wrapped around her coffee mug, her heart settling in a way it hadn't for years. After supper, when the children were asleep, Gideon stepped onto the porch, eyes turned toward the chicken coop. Vera joined him, pulling on a coat. "Tomorrow, we'll put up a fence for the garden," she said. He nodded. "And get more chickens. And—" He paused. "A dog to watch the place." She gave a rare smile, this time without pulling it back. "I think I want to stay longer than I thought." He didn't answer right away, just looked at her. Sometimes that kind of silence is the surest answer there is. The next morning, sun crested the hill, spilling gold over the yard. Dew still clung to the grass, catching the light like beads of glass. Gideon carried a hoe, Vera a basket of seed. Rhoda and Russ ran ahead toward the open plot east of the house, the ground that would become their first garden. "What do we plant first, Mama?" Rhoda asked, clutching a small sack of beans. "Beans first, then squash and corn," Vera said, her voice steady, as if she'd been doing this all her life. Though she hadn't touched earth this way in years, Gideon set posts, stretched line to frame the fence that would keep the stock out. Russ followed with his small hammer, tapping each post after Gideon, not to help, but, as he put it, to stamp it. The sound of hammer and hoe, the laughter of children, the whisper of wind through the birch, these folded into the smell of fresh earth breaking open, a scent like opening the pages of an old book. And maybe you can feel it. A home doesn't start with a roof and walls, but with hands in the soil and the will to stay. When the fence was up, they began planting. Rhoda dropped seeds one by one, while Russ tossed handfuls, making Vera laugh aloud, a sound she hadn't let herself make since leaving Idaho. Gideon, leaning on the fence, let the smile rise in his eyes. It was the look of a man seeing something he'd long hoped for finally take root. By evening, the little garden lay under a smooth blanket of soil, the fence snug around it. The four of them stood together, looking at what they'd made. "We could plant flowers along the fence," Vera said, brushing dirt from her hands. Gideon nodded. "Any kind you like. This is our land." Our land. The words fell quiet in her ears, but echoed deep. She touched the gray scarf at her neck, the red stitch against her skin. A reminder that maybe, just maybe, she'd stay long enough to see those seeds come up. 3 days later, Gideon came back from town with a crate of chickens, 10 hens, and a speckled roosters. Russ whooped, running circles around them. Rhoda immediately asked, "Can we name them?" "You can," Vera said, smiling. "But don't forget to feed them, just because you're busy naming them." They built the coop beside the garden with leftover lumber from the new rooms. Gideon framed it. Vera fitted the door. Rhoda spread straw inside, and Russ stood guard as if the hens might escape. By dawn the next morning, the yard rang with a chorus of crowing, not a lone sound, but a spread of it, pulling the valley awake. Vera opened the door, cold air slipping in, but the sound of the hens brought warmth with it. The children ran out with grain. Russ scattered his wildly, sending hens flapping, while Rhoda fed them straight from her hand. Vera leaned against the coop door, arms crossed, watching with a look Gideon, standing back, had never seen on her face before. Something rooted, something sure. And maybe you know it too. How home can be found in the first sound you hear when you open your eyes. That afternoon, Vera gathered the first eggs still warm, their shells pale and clean. She washed them, set them in a basket, and placed them on the shelf beside the gray scarf. The red stitch faced outward, but now it sat beside something from the present, not just the past. "Enough for cornbread?" Gideon asked, glancing from the eggs to her. "Enough to try," she said, the corner of her mouth lifting. And in that small kitchen, with the smells of soil, straw, and fresh eggs, the promise we'll learn together was stitched in one more time. Not 1 week later, the garden was sprouting green shoots. The hens laid steady. That evening, Vera decided on their first supper, made entirely from what they'd raised and grown. She picked tender beans, pulled carrots, and took the morning's eggs from the basket. Rhoda helped trim the beans, her small hands careful not to snap them. Russ was set to wiping the table, though he ended up drawing horses and chickens in the damp streaks, making his mother and sister laugh. Gideon built the fire, set the cast iron pot on, the air filled with the scents of fresh carrots, eggs whisked light, and cornbread browning over pine smoke. The kitchen, once so still, now hummed with the sound of spoons against pots, quick footsteps, the pop of the fire, and short, warm words traded back and forth. When the food was set out, cornbread, eggs with green beans, and stewed carrots, they sat around the table. The fare was simple, but they ate slowly, as if wanting to keep the taste of earth, work, and the days they'd built this with their own hands better than Elk Bend, Rhoda declared. "Because you planted it," Vera told her, giving her daughter's shoulder a gentle squeeze. Russ nodded like he'd confirmed a law of nature. Gideon didn't need to say home. It was already there in the air they breathed. And maybe you can feel it, how a home is chosen again every day. Not in words, but in a meal from what your own land gives you. After dinner, the children played in the yard under the fading light. Vera stayed in the kitchen, wiping the table with the gray scarf. The red stitch caught the lamp's glow, brighter than it had been before. Gideon stepped in from the porch. He didn't ask, didn't interrupt, just stood there, as if he knew that tonight marked something in her, not only because they'd eaten from their own land, but because she'd called this place home in her heart, even if she hadn't said it aloud. Night came down slow, like a thick quilt over the valley. The birch leaves whispered in the soft wind. The barn was quiet. The hens settled. In the kitchen, the lamp threw a warm ring of light, stretching the shadows of Gideon and Vera across the walls. The children slept in their new room, breaths deep and even. Vera peeked in, seeing Rhoda's arm draped across her brother. She closed the door gently and went back to the kitchen. Gideon sat by the stove, hands folded, eyes on the embers. She took the chair across from him. For a while, neither spoke. The wind and the crackle of wood filled the space. "I used to think," Vera said at last, "that if I stayed in one place long enough, someone would find me. I wouldn't be safe." Gideon looked up, calm and steady, and now she gave a faint smile, almost not a smile at all. "Now I think, if you stay long enough, you learn how to protect each other." It wasn't a vow, but it was a promise just as heavy. Gideon didn't answer. He stood, took the gray scarf from the shelf, and set it in her lap. The red stitch still faced outward, a small, stubborn sign of the choice to remain. Vera set the scarf aside, then let her hand rest in his. They sat like that, not needing to fill the quiet. Firelight danced in their eyes, warmth moving from hands to hearts, and from hearts into the room itself. Outside, the spring wind still moved, but it no longer sounded like the call of the road. It was only the sound of wind across a roof. The roof of a home the four of them had started to build from wood, and for easy through our earth. And the most important thing of all, staying together. Part 5. A lifetime together. The creek wound through the valley like a silver thread, catching the early summer sun. The breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and the soft rustle of birch leaves. Vera stood in the shade, her hair crowned with white and gold wildflowers Rhoda had tucked there. No veil, no jewels, only a rare, unguarded peace shining in her eyes. Gideon came from the far bank, white shirt worn thin, dark work pants, boots still dusted from the road, no bouquet in his hand, no ring flashing in the light, only the steady gaze that had followed her from the day they met in the winter woods. The minister was a long-bearded man with a voice deep enough to settle under the trees. Only 4 stood there: Vera, Gideon, Rhoda, and Russ. Rhoda held her mother's hand tight, while Russ bit his lip, trying his best to stand tall. When the minister asked if they would stay beside each other in every season of life, Vera didn't cry. She simply gripped Gideon's hand tighter and answered, yes, with quiet certainty. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried far in the hearts of those who heard, because they knew it came from a soul that had weathered its share of breaking. They didn't rush into a kiss. They just leaned their foreheads together, breathing each other in, as if to remember the warmth and the rhythm of the other's breath. It was the kind of love that didn't need display deep enough to stand on its own without proof. After the vows, the 4 of them sat on a wool blanket by the creek, sharing bread and coffee. Children's laughter mixed with running water, with wind, with the quiet music of a new beginning. Small, but meant to last. That summer in Montana stretched green with young grass and wildflowers. Life after the wedding didn't change with fanfare. It deepened quietly, the way a small creek wears the earth deeper. Day after day, each morning, Vera rose barefoot on the pine floor and opened the door to let the light in. Rhoda helped her feed the hens. Russ ran to the barn to find Gideon, eyes bright when he was lifted into the saddle for a slow loop around the corral. The new room smelled faintly of fresh-cut wood. Children's laughter spilled through the house, and every evening they gathered at the table over bowls of stew. No one spoke of the past, but everyone felt it. The fear had moved on, making room for something rare and steady. Autumn came. Vera began sewing clothes from scraps of fabric. Gideon built shelves for jars of pickled vegetables and cured meat. Each day, they found small reasons to smile: a squash, larger than expected, a golden afternoon sky, or simply the nod they shared when their eyes met across the yard. Some nights, when Rhoda and Russ had gone to bed, Vera and Gideon sat on the porch, holding hands, saying nothing, watching the stars. No more vows were needed each day. They stayed was proof enough. The years moved like Lolo Creek, sometimes quiet and slow, sometimes rushing hard, through seasons of changing leaves and winters that buried the porch rail in snow. One habit never shifted. Every evening, they sat side by side on the porch bench, hands finding each other, eyes on the sun sinking behind the bitter roots. Rhoda grew quick-handed like her mother, but strong-willed like Gideon. She loved to write, forever ink-stained, ready to argue her point to the last word. Russ was quieter, whittling little wooden gifts for the neighbor children. They both forgot the days of running, remembering only that home was where laughter lived, where bread baked warm, and where a steady hand ruffled their hair each night. Gideon's hair silvered at the temples. Vera's eyes softened, though fine lines gathered at the corners. They were no longer the cautious pair they once were, but 2 people who had built every wall, planted every row, and seen each other through the hardest winters. One late autumn afternoon, golden birch leaves covering the yard, Vera placed her calloused hand in his. "Do you remember," she asked, "when I told you, I ain't good at love?" Gideon smiled, his gaze still on the burning horizon. I remember what I said back. We'll learn together. If you'll stay. They looked at each other. This time, no promise was needed. Their whole life was the answer. Years later, lavender bloomed purple along the fence line, its scent drifting in through every window. Gideon was past 70, his back bent a little, steps slower than before. Vera's hair was nearly white, but her hands still moved quick, pulling weeds, gathering beans, as if her heart had never aged. That summer afternoon, sunlight lay like honey over the fields. Rhoda and Russ had families of their own, but often returned with their children. The sound of grandchildren laughing rolled through the valley. Gideon sat in the old porch chair, Kane leaning nearby. Vera brought out 2 cups of herb tea, setting them on the small table between them. They sat, as they had on countless evenings, watching the sun drop behind the bitterroots. Gideon's hand reached for hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. Vera leaned her head on his shoulder, eyes half closed, smiling. "You know," she murmured. All my life, I never ran again. Because you found a place to stop, and you were that place." Gideon didn't answer. He simply turned her hand over and pressed a kiss to the back of it. That hand that had once trembled in fear, now as steady as the day he first took it. The sun slipped away, leaving a sky streak deep blue and orange. Crickets began their chorus. "I think," Vera whispered, "I've gotten good at love." Gideon chuckled, voice roughened with age. "I know, and I'm still learning more every day." They sat until night covered the valley, hands still linked. In that moment, they both understood love didn't come from grand declarations, but from the choice to stay, day after day. That was the truest vow of all. Looking back on their road from that cold gray afternoon in the pine woods, where a cowboy wordlessly held out his hand to a stranger through the seasons of planting, mornings at the stove, and sunsets where their hands always found each other, we can see it clear. Love never starts with perfection. It starts with a small choice, the choice to stay, to face one hard day together, and then another, to believe in something not yet perfect, but real enough to warm the heart. Gideon and Vera didn't find a flawless love out of dreams. They found a home built from patience, from the grip of a steady hand, from a grateful glance, and from a simple promise: we'll learn to love if you'll stay. And now, I want to ask you, do you believe that a single gentle promise can change the course of someone's life? If your answer is yes, leave a heart in the comments and share this story with someone you hope will stay by your side. Always.